In Climate Watch, as temperatures rise across the country, the number of power grid failures is also going up. And now, a new study is warning about just how dangerous it can be when heat waves coincide with blackouts. Brian Stone Jr. is one of the authors of that study. He's a professor at the School of City and Regional Planning at Georgia Institute of Technology. Thank you so much for joining us, Brian. I found this study quite fascinating, and I want to just start off with sort of the basics, right? The two focuses of the study. First off, I think when people hear climate change, they understand that it is linked to the temperatures going up. But just tell me, what have we been seeing in this country in terms of numbers of heat waves or the intensity of the heat? How are things been changing? And then what is the connection between climate change and power grid failures?
Yeah, good morning. Both great questions and the key focus of our work on this. And so in general, with heat waves, we're seeing every dimension we can measure of heat waves are increasing over the last 10 to 20 years. Really, it's a longer term trend and increasing rapidly. So the number of heat waves, the duration of heat waves, the timing and the season. So heat waves are starting earlier, and then the intensity. And so heat waves, and again, every dimension are increasing over time. We expect that with climate change, and we expect that to continue moving forward. What is not as widely studied are blackouts. And so we know there's a relationship between heat waves and energy demand and just hot weather in the summer. And so we're finding that a disproportionate number of blackouts are happening during the summer. And so that's when we have the greatest demand on the grid. But also we see an uptick in storm activity. And so we get into the hurricane season. And so that's driving the frequency of blackouts. And then last, things that we may not think about, like a drought, reliance on just the natural ecosystem and rivers is critical for our power plants, for cooling water for our power plants. So if we have drought conditions, that can also drive blackouts.
And I imagine in the states where wildfires are also an issue, and we saw in California these rolling brownouts and stuff because there was a concern about wildfires starting because of the aging power grid. So here you have these two elements. If they overlap, the situation could be dire. I know here where I'm at in Philadelphia, often when there's a heat wave, even though there are no blackouts, people die because a lot of people don't have air conditioning. So you took a look at 3 different cities, Atlanta, Detroit, and Phoenix. And sort of took a look at the numbers and how people would be affected should they see a heat wave and a power grid failure happening at the same time. What were the results of your study?
Yeah, and so what is new here is we're focused on not just the temperature outside. So whenever we have a heat wave, we know it gets very hot outside, but actually understanding what the heat exposures are inside people's homes. And so we looked at every single house, every residential structure across these 3 cities, Atlanta, Detroit, and Phoenix. And we found that we are experiencing significant exposures. And it's important to note, as you highlight, Anne-Marie, that for many residents of these cities, they don't have continuous access to air conditioning. This is particularly true in Detroit, where maybe 60% of the homes have air conditioning. So anytime you have hot weather, you have pretty extreme exposures inside the home. And then, of course, when you have that compounded with a blackout, everyone loses air conditioning. And so in a city like Phoenix, where both you have really hot temperatures outside, and so we're seeing, average summer temperatures are high temperatures well above 100 degrees. 99% of the population has air conditioning. So when you have a blackout, everybody's experiencing temperatures well over 100 degrees, 115 degrees in their homes. And so that is very, very hazardous. And so overall, what we find is between 2/3 and 100% of every household in these 3 cities would experience what's dangerous exposures inside the home. We look at the National Weather Service heat risk classes, and so extreme caution and danger are the classifications for heat index, which means that you are at risk of heat exhaustion or heat stroke. And heat stroke can often be fatal. So we're seeing a risk of heat illness or death for 2/3 or more of the population in these 3 cities. So those are quite significant findings of the level of risk we're confronting.
And income level also plays a role in this.
Yeah, really important. And so we wanted to look at this for 2 reasons. So we know that income is an important driver because it relates to whether we have access to air conditioning. It's important to highlight that while many homes have air conditioning, not everybody uses it. The power bill can be a significant economic expense for households that are in the lower income range of the spectrum. And so we're finding that for the lowest 20% in terms of income, risk is amplified for two reasons. One, less likely to have air conditioning, less likely to use it. And two, we find the highest heat exposures actually happen in smaller one-story houses, single-family houses. And so over these three cities, lower income residents are more likely to live in these houses that are older, smaller, the insulation values are lower, and so the heat risk is higher. And so low income is definitely a significant driver of heat risk, whether there's a blackout or not.
Yeah, it's a great point. You know, we see this, I mentioned this, we see this in the summertime all the time, particularly older residents who are on a fixed income. They don't want to run their air conditioning, so they run a fan instead, which just circulates the heat inside the house. And then we have deaths. Right. Even though there are cooling centers and places for people to go, sometimes they can't get out of the house, you know? So I guess the big question is, this is some pretty dire news. What does the U.S. need to do going forward to combat the potential threats of heat waves and power failures?
Yeah, and so we wanted to look at how prepared we are for these events now, because what we find is that the rate of blackouts is increasing really dramatically. And so since 2015, the number of major blackouts in the United States has doubled, the number per year. And so we're seeing really a rapid increase in the number of blackouts every year. So how prepared are cities? And these three cities, it's a mixed bag. You know, we look at the number of cooling centers, which is kind of the shelter of last resort if you don't have air conditioning or if you lose it due to a blackout. We find in Atlanta we have 5 cooling centers for the entire city. In Detroit we have 15, and in Phoenix you have 18. This number of cooling centers would at most accommodate 2% of the population of these cities. And so that is, that's going to be insufficient as far as accommodating a sufficient number of residents. And then you combine that with the fact that these cooling centers are not required to have backup power generation. So if there is a blackout, some may have generators. We find that in Atlanta and Detroit, most do not have generators, and it's not required. And so that really raises questions around what is the level of preparedness for what is a very high health risk and something that's immediate in terms of its timing. This is not, decades into the future. This is this summer. And it appears that these three cities and the input that we've received from FEMA in general is that most cities are not particularly well prepared for this situation.
Well, we saw what happened in Texas in the winter time when that power grid was not prepared for the severe weather and the demand. Let's not forget the sort of risk can occur in the summertime as well. A fascinating study. Brian Stone Jr., thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Anne Marie.